The morning fog rolled across the Pacific like a ghostly shroud, its tendrils reaching toward the California coastline where Naval Air Station Alameda buzzed with wartime urgency. It was October 15th, 1944, and Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan stood on the tarmac, adjusting his leather flight jacket against the pre-dawn chill. At 28 years old, he was considered a veteran pilot, having completed 47 combat missions over the Pacific theater. His steel blue eyes reflected the same determination that had earned him 2 distinguished flying crosses and the respect of every man in his squadron. The war was entering its 4th year, and every mission carried the weight of a nation's hopes. Sullivan's Grumman F-6F Hellcat, designated as Navy number 77492, gleamed under the hangar lights. Despite the early hour, ground crews had worked through the night preparing the aircraft for what intelligence officers had classified as a routine reconnaissance mission along the Northern California coast. But in wartime, nothing was ever truly routine. The briefing had been unusually sparse, conducted by a stern-faced intelligence officer whose credentials seemed to extend far beyond the typical Navy chain of command. The mission parameters were straightforward, yet oddly specific. Fly northwest along the coastline toward Point Reyes, then follow a prescribed route inland toward the Russian River Valley. Maintain radio silence except for predetermined checkpoints, photograph any unusual ground activity, and return to base within 4 hours. What made the assignment peculiar was the emphasis on complete secrecy and the presence of 2 men in civilian suits who observed the briefing without speaking a single word. Sullivan had questioned the mission's classification level, noting discrepancies in the paperwork that suggested involvement from agencies beyond standard naval intelligence. His squadron commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain William Hartley, had been unusually tense during the pre-flight discussion, repeatedly emphasizing the importance of following orders precisely and avoiding any deviation from the prescribed flight path. When Sullivan pressed for additional details about potential threats or the specific nature of what he might encounter, Hartley's response was uncharacteristically sharp. Follow orders, maintain radio discipline, and ask no further questions. The Hellcat's engine roared, too. Life with mechanical precision. Its 18-cylinder Pratt and Whitney radial power plant generating over 2,000 horsepower. Sullivan performed his standard per-flight checks with practiced efficiency, testing control surfaces, verifying instrument readings, and confirming communication equipment functionality. The aircraft carried extra fuel tanks that extended its range to nearly 400 m, far more than the prescribed mission would require. Everything appeared normal, yet an inexplicable sense of unease settled over him like the coastal fog itself. Tower clearance came at precisely 0630 hours, and Sullivan taxied toward the runway as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. The control tower operator's voice crackled through his headset with routine departure instructions, but Sullivan detected an underlying tension that matched his own growing apprehension. As he advanced the throttle for takeoff, the Hellcat's powerful engine pulled him skyward into what would become one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. The takeoff proceeded without incident, and Sullivan banked northwest along the coastline as instructed. Below him, the California shore stretched like a ribbon between the dark Pacific and the awakening landscape of farms and forests. The flight path took him over the familiar landmarks of San Francisco Bay, past the Golden Gate Bridge shrouded in morning mist, and along the rugged Marin County coastline. Radio traffic was minimal, limited to the predetermined checkpoint communications that confirmed his position and progress. At 0715 hours, he transmitted his first position report. Passing Point Reyes, maintaining assigned altitude of 8,000 feet, no unusual observations to report. The second checkpoint came 30 minutes later as he turned inland toward the Russian River Valley, following a route that seemed to serve no apparent reconnaissance purpose. His voice recorded by base radio operators remained calm and professional. Base control, Navy 77492, passing checkpoint 2, continuing mission as briefed, weather clear, visibility unlimited. Those would be the last words ever heard from Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan. What happened during the following hour and 17 minutes remained a complete mystery for 8 decades. Sullivan failed to reach checkpoint 3 at the designated time of 0830 hours. When 15 minutes passed without communication, Base Control attempted to establish radio contact. Their calls went unanswered. By 0900 hours, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway, involving multiple aircraft, Coast Guard vessels, and ground teams combing the rugged coastline and inland valleys where Sullivan might have gone down. The search continued for 2 weeks, covering thousands of square miles of ocean, forest, and mountainous terrain. Military investigators interviewed every person who might have observed aircraft activity that morning. Radar stations reported tracking Sullivan's Hellcat until approximately 0755 hours, at which point the aircraft signal simply vanished from their screens over the mountainous terrain east of the Russian River. The disappearance occurred in an area where radar coverage was sporadic due to the challenging topography, making it impossible to determine whether the signal loss was due to equipment failure, terrain, masking, or aircraft destruction. No distress calls had been received, no emergency beacons detected, and no wreckage discovered despite the most comprehensive search effort mounted by the Pacific Fleet since the war began. Coast Guard cutters patrolled the offshore waters while Army Air Force's search planes systematically covered every square mile of the inland search area. Ground teams composed of military personnel, civilian volunteers, and local law enforcement officers combed through dense forests, steep ravines, and remote valleys where an aircraft might crash without being immediately visible from the air. The official incident report, classified at the highest levels and sealed in Navy archives, concluded that Lieutenant Commander Sullivan and his aircraft were presumed lost due to unknown causes. The mission details remained so highly classified that even Sullivan's family was provided only the most basic information. Their son and husband had died in service to his country during a training flight along the California coast. No mention was made of the reconnaissance mission, the mysterious intelligence officers, or the strange circumstances surrounding his disappearance. James Robert Sullivan's story began in the small farming community of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he was born on March 22, 1916, to Patrick and Margaret Sullivan. His father operated a successful grain elevator business that served the surrounding agricultural region, while his mother taught elementary school at the local one-room schoolhouse. The youngest of 4 children, James displayed an early fascination with mechanical devices and flying machines that would eventually shape his destiny and lead him toward a career that would intersect with some of the most classified military operations of the Second World War. Growing up during the 1920s and early 30s, young James was captivated by the barnstorming pilots who occasionally visited rural Iowa, performing aerial stunts and offering rides to anyone brave enough to climb into their fabric-covered biplanes. His parents initially viewed this interest as a harmless childhood phase, but James' passion for aviation only intensified as he matured. He spent countless hours reading aviation magazines, building intricate model airplanes with remarkable attention to detail, and dreaming of soaring through the clouds like his heroes Charles Lindbergh and Jimmy Doolittle. Academic achievement came naturally to James, who consistently ranked among the top students in his graduating class despite dividing his attention between studies and mechanical projects. His aptitude for mathematics and physics impressed his teachers, who recognized the analytical mind that would later prove invaluable in military aviation. James' mechanical skills were evident in his ability to repair farm equipment, automobiles, and any mechanical device that neighbors brought to the Sullivan household. These abilities earned him part-time employment at the local Ford dealership while still in high school, where he learned advanced mechanical techniques and developed troubleshooting skills that would serve him well as a military pilot. The high school years were marked by James' increasing involvement in aviation-related activities. He joined the school's Net Aviation Club, where students built and flew model aircraft while studying the principles of flight and navigation. James emerged as a natural leader in these activities, organizing flying competitions and teaching younger students the fundamentals of aerodynamics. His teachers recognized his potential and encouraged him to pursue higher education, leading to his acceptance at Iowa State University with a full academic scholarship that would allow him to pursue his dreams without burdening his family financially. Iowa State, James majored in mechanical engineering while participating enthusiastically in the university's GWII Emerging Aviation program. The program, established in partnership with the Civil Aeronautics Administration, provided students with both theoretical knowledge and practical flying experience that was becoming increasingly valuable as the nation began to recognize the importance of aviation in national defense. James excelled in both areas, earning his private pilot's license during his sophomore year and accumulating over 100 flight hours by graduation. His instructors consistently praised his natural flying ability, describing him as intuitive, precise, and exceptionally calm under pressure. The university years also provided James with opportunities to develop his leadership skills and broaden his understanding of the world beyond rural Iowa. He served as president of the Engineering Society, organized volunteer activities in the local community, and maintained academic excellence while working part-time jobs to supplement his scholarship funding. Fellow students remember him as serious but approachable, with a dry sense of humor and an unwavering commitment to helping others succeed. These personal qualities would later make him an effective military leader and earn the respect of the men who served under his command. The attack on Pearl Harbor occurred during James's senior year, fundamentally altering his life plans and those of millions of other young Americans. Rather than pursuing the civilian engineering career he had originally planned, he immediately applied for Navy flight training, motivated by both patriotic duty and his burning desire to serve as a combat pilot in what promised to be the greatest conflict in human history. His academic record, extensive flying experience, and demonstrated leadership qualities made him an ideal candidate for the Navy's accelerated pilot training program that was rapidly expanding to meet wartime demands. Naval flight training began at Pensacola Naval Air Station in February 1942, where James joined hundreds of other young men from across America who shared his determination to serve their country as naval aviators. The program was intensive and demanding, designed to transform civilians into combat-ready aviators in the shortest possible time while maintaining the high standards that naval aviation had established during peacetime. James thrived in this challenging environment, demonstrating exceptional skills in aircraft handling, navigation, gunnery, and formation, flying that marked him as a future combat leader. The training regimen was physically and mentally exhausting, with days that began before dawn and continued well into the evening. Students learned to fly multiple aircraft types, from basic trainers to advanced fighters, while mastering the complex skills needed for carrier operations and combat flying. James' engineering background gave him advantages in understanding aircraft systems and performance characteristics, while his natural flying ability allowed him to excel in the hands-on aspects off-pilot training. His instructors noted his ability to remain focused and analytical even during the most stressful training scenarios, qualities that would prove invaluable in the life and death situations he would later face in combat. Upon completing flight training with honors, Enan James Sullivan was assigned to Fighting Squadron 32, newly equipped with the formidable Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter that would become the backbone of Navy fighter operations in the Pacific Theater. The squadron deployed to the Pacific in June 1943, initially operating from the carrier USS Yorktown before transitioning to land-based operations in the Marshall Islands as American forces began their inexorable advance toward the Japanese home islands. Sullivan's first combat missions involved escorting bombing raids against Japanese-held atolls, where he quickly established himself as a skilled and dependable pilot who could be counted on to complete any assigned mission regardless of the dangers involved. His combat record was exemplary from the very beginning. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Sullivan shot down 3 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, demonstrating the tactical skills and aggressive spirit that earned him his first Distinguished Flying Cross. His squadron mates respected his tactical judgment and relied on his steady leadership during the chaotic aerial battles that characterized Pacific Theater combat. Sullivan had an intuitive understanding of aerial tactics and the ability to remain calm under fire, qualities that made him an effective flight leader and earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. The promotion to lieutenant came quickly. Recognition of both his exceptional flying skills and his natural ability totally add other pilots in combat situations where split-second decisions could mean a difference between life and death. Sullivan's flight leaders consistently praised his performance in combat, noting his ability to maintain formation integrity while engaging enemy aircraft and his skill at protecting less experienced pilots during their first combat missions. These leadership qualities combined with his technical expertise and proven combat effectiveness marked him as a rising star in naval aviation who was destined for greater responsibilities and more challenging assignments. Between combat deployments, Sullivan returned to California for advanced training and aircraft familiarization programs that kept pace with the rapid technological developments occurring throughout the war. It was during this period that he met and married Catherine Elizabeth Morrison, a Navy nurse stationed at Oakland Naval Hospital, who shared his dedication to serving their country during the war effort. Their courtship was brief but intense, conducted against the backdrop of wartime uncertainty that compressed normal relationship timelines and made every moment together precious and meaningful. They were married on September 8, 1943, in a simple ceremony attended by squadron members and hospital staff who had become their extended family during the uncertain times of war. Catherine later described her husband as thoughtful, dedicated, and quietly confident with a gentle manner that contrasted with the aggressive skills he displayed as a combat pilot. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, preferring to focus on their plans for life after the war and the family they hoped to start once peace returned to the world. They discussed returning to Iowa, where James intended to establish an aircraft maintenance business using the skills he had acquired during military service, while Catherine planned to continue nursing as they built their civilian lives together. The couple's time together was necessarily limited by the demands of war and military assignments that kept them separated for months at a time. James' second deployment took him back to the Pacific for operations in the Mariana Islands, where he participated in the invasion of Saipan and subsequent campaigns that brought American forces closer to the Japanese mainland. His second Distinguished Flying Cross came during a mission to protect damaged bombers returning from raids on Japanese positions. Despite being outnumbered and running low on fuel, Sullivan engaged enemy fighters that threatened the vulnerable bombers, shooting down 2 additional aircraft and enabling all the bombers to reach safety with their crews intact. By late summer 1944, Sullivan had completed his required combat tour and was reassigned to Naval Air Station Alameda for what should have been a period of rest and training duty. The assignment was considered a reward for his distinguished service, offering an opportunity to remain stateside while contributing to pilot training programs and sharing his combat experience with newly trained aviators preparing for their own deployments to the Pacific Theater. Catherine joined him in California, and they rented a small apartment in Oakland, finally able to enjoy something approaching normal married life after months of separation and the constant stress of combat operations. The routine training and administrative duties at Alama seemed to suit Sullivan perfectly after months of combat stress and the constant danger of aerial combat. Fellow officers described him as relaxed and optimistic about the war's eventual conclusion, with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven himself under fire and earned the right to look forward to peacetime. He wrote regularly to his family in Iowa, describing California's pleasant climate and expressing confidence that he would soon complete his military service and return home to start the civilian life he had postponed for military duty. His final letter, received by his parents 3 days before his disappearance, spoke enthusiastically about civilian flying opportunities and his plans to pursue a commercial pilot's license that would allow him to remain in aviation while building a family business. Catherine's memories of their last evening together would haunt her for the rest of her life, becoming increasingly precious as the years passed, and the mystery of her husband's fate remained unsolved. They had dinner at a small restaurant in Oakland, discussing plans for a delayed honeymoon trip to San Francisco. Once James completed his current assignment and could take extended leave, he seemed unusually thoughtful that evening, mentioning that he had been selected for a special mission, but providing no details about its nature or duration. When Catherine pressed for more information, James explained that the mission was classified but appeared routine, involving coastal reconnaissance work that would keep him away for only a few hours and should present no unusual dangers. The morning off October 15th began like any other day during their brief time together in California. With the normal routines of military life and the comfortable domesticity they had finally been able establish, James rose early for his pre-flight briefing, kissing Catherine goodbye as she prepared for her shift at the hospital where her nursing skills were desperately needed to treat wounded servicemen returning from Pacific theater operations. His final words to her were typically optimistic and loving. "I'll see you tonight, and we can finish planning that San Francisco trip." She never saw him again, and those words would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. The day Lieutenant Commander Sullivan vanished began in the pre-dawn darkness of Naval Air Station Alama, where unusual activity had been observed by base personnel throughout the preceding week. Ground crews reported the presence of unfamiliar aircraft on the flight line. Civilian vehicles with government license plates in either restricted areas, and an increased security presence that seemed disproportionate to normal training operations. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the kind of secretive urgency that typically preceded major combat operations or highly classified missions that extended beyond routine military activities. At 0400 hours, Sullivan received notification to report for an immediate briefing regarding his morning mission. This timing was unusual, as standard reconnaissance flights were typically briefed the previous evening to allow pilots adequate rest and preparation time. The notification came through irregular channels delivered by a petty officer who claimed to be acting on direct orders from Squadron Command, but could provide no additional information about the mission's nature or urgency. The unusual procedure was the first indication that this assignment would be different from the routine training flights that had occupied Sullivan's time since his return to stateside duty. The briefing room was unlike any Sullivan had previously encountered at Alama. Located in a basement area of the intelligence building that he had never accessed before, the space was windowless and furnished only with basic military furniture, creating an atmosphere of secrecy that seemed more appropriate for classified operations than routine reconnaissance missions. Present were his squadron. Occurrences and into the mountainous terrain where radar coverage was sporadic and radio communication could be affected by topographical interference. The route followed river, valleys, and mountain ridges that were sparsely populated and seldom traversed by aircraft, creating conditions where unusual events might occur without witnesses. Ground observers in the Russian River Valley area reported hearing aircraft engines during the appropriate time period, but the mountainous terrain and dense forest cover made visual confirmation difficult. A forest ranger stationed near Jernaville reported the sound of a single-engine aircraft flying inland from the coast following the river valley toward the mountainous interior. The timing of this observation corresponded with Sullivan's planned route, confirming that his mission continued to proceed normally through the second phase of his flight. The second checkpoint report transmitted at 0745 hours would be the last confirmed communication from Sullivan's aircraft. Base radio logs recorded his position as being over the designated coordinates inland from the coast, maintaining assigned altitude and continuing the mission as briefed. Signal strength was strong and clear, with no indication of equipment problems or environmental interference that might affect communication or navigation systems. Sullivan's voice remained calm and professional, showing no signs of distress or concern about his situation. What happened during the 33 minutes following that final radio transmission became the central mystery of the entire incident. Radar contact with Sullivan's aircraft was lost at approximately 0818 hours when his transponder signal simply vanished from ground control displays. The loss of radar contact occurred over mountainous terrain where signal interference was common, initially causing no immediate alarm among radar operators who assumed the aircraft would reappear as it cleared the terrain and returned to areas with better radar coverage. The mountainous terrain east off the Russian River Valley was known for creating radar shadows and communication dead zones that could temporarily isolate aircraft from ground control. Pilots flying in the area were accustomed to brief periods without radio contact, and radar operators were familiar with aircraft signals disappearing and reappearing as aircraft maneuvered through the complex topography. The initial loss of contact with Sullivan's aircraft was therefore treated as routine, with no immediate concern about his safety or mission status. When Sullivan failed to transmit his third checkpoint report at 0830 hours, Base Control attempted to establish radio contact using standard communication procedures. The initial calls were routine, as missed checkpoint reports sometimes occurred due to radio problems, pilot distraction, or minor navigational difficulties that caused timing discrepancies. However, when these calls went unanswered despite clear atmospheric conditions and proper equipment function on the ground, concern began to grow among control tower personnel who recognized that something unusual was occurring. 15 minutes of unsuccessful radio contact attempts triggered emergency protocols that had been established for missing aircraft incidents. The procedures called for expanding communication attempts to include all available radio frequencies and emergency channels while simultaneously alerting search and rescue organizations about the potential aircraft emergency. Base commanders were notified of the situation, and preliminary search plans were activated to prepare for immediate deployment of rescue assets if the aircraft could not be located through continued radio contact attempts. The massive search effort that followed Sullivan's disappearance represented one of the most intensive aircraft search operations ever conducted by Pacific Fleet forces during the Second World War. Within 2 hours of the missed radio contact, search aircraft from multiple bases were systematically combing the suspected crash area, while Coast Guard vessels began patrolling the coastal waters where Sullivan might have gone down if he had attempted to return to base and crashed in the ocean. Ground teams composed of military personnel and civilian volunteers started searching the rugged terrain of Mendocino and Sonoma counties, focusing on areas where aircraft wreckage might be concealed by dense forest canopy or steep terrain. Search operations continued around the clock for 14 days, expanding to cover thousands of square miles of ocean, forest, and mountainous terrain that might contain evidence of Sullivan's fate. Military investigators interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, analyzed every piece of radar data, and examined weather records for any factor that might explain Sullivan's disappearance. Despite the exhaustive effort and the most advanced search techniques available in 1944, no trace of the missing pilot or his aircraft was ever discovered, creating a mystery that would persist for 8 decades. The official investigation into Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance was conducted under extraordinary security measures that far exceeded normal procedures for missing aircraft incidents. Led by a joint team of Navy investigators and civilian intelligence officers whose credentials extended far beyond normal military channels, the investigation was classified at levels typically reserved for the most sensitive wartime secrets. Personnel involved in the investigation were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing any aspect of the case with unauthorized persons, and all findings were sealed in classified archives that would remain inaccessible for decades. Investigation team members were selected based on their security clearances and prior experience with sensitive military matters rather than their expertise in aircraft accident investigation. This unusual staffing decision suggested that the investigation's primary concern was protecting classified information rather than determining the actual cause of Sullivan's disappearance. Traditional accident investigators were excluded from the process despite their superior qualifications for analyzing aircraft incidents, indicating that the case involved factors beyond normal aviation safety concerns. The investigators' first priority was interviewing every person who had any contact with Sullivan and knowledge of his final mission. But the questioning focused more on maintaining secrecy than gathering factual information about the circumstances of his disappearance. Base personnel, including ground crews, mechanics, radio operators, and intelligence officers, were subjected to intensive interrogation that emphasized their obligations to maintain security rather than their potential contributions to understanding what had happened to the missing pilot. Many interviewees later reported feeling that they were being treated as potential security risks rather than helpful witnesses to a tragic accident. Captain Hartley, Sullivan's squadron commander, was questioned extensively about the mission's classification and operational details, but the investigation records suggest that Hartley himself was not fully informed about the mission's true purpose or the identity of the civilian intelligence officers who had organized it. His testimony revealed frustration with the unusual command structure and his exclusion from normal mission planning processes, indicating that the operation was controlled by agencies outside the standard Navy chain of command. Hartley's responses showed that even senior military officers were kept in the dark about the true nature of Sullivan's assignment. Ground radar stations that had tracked Sullivan's flight were required to surrender all recording equipment and documentation to the investigation team immediately after the search was called off. Radar operators were questioned intensively about their observations and ordered to destroy any personal notes or records related to the incident. The radar data itself was classified and removed from normal Navy archives, making it unavailable to subsequent investigators or researchers attempting to understand the circumstances of Sullivan's disappearance. This unusual treatment of routine operational data suggested that Sullivan's flight had involved activities that required extraordinary protection. The investigation team devoted considerable effort to examining Sullivan's background, personal relationships, and potential motivations for deliberate disappearance, despite the complete absence of evidence suggesting such possibilities. This line of inquiry seemed inappropriate for what should have been a straightforward accident investigation, suggesting that investigators suspected Sullivan might have intentionally deviated from his mission or somehow become involved in activities that would require concealment from his own military superiors. Such suspicions were completely inconsistent with Sullivan's exemplary service record and the testimony of everyone who knew him personally. Catherine Sullivan was subjected to particularly intensive questioning about her husband's mental state, political beliefs, and any unusual behavior preceding his disappearance. Investigators seemed especially interested in determining whether Sullivan had expressed any doubts about the war effort, dissatisfaction with military service, or unusual interest in political matters that might suggest disloyalty or security risks. Catherine later described these interviews as hostile and insulting, with investigators implying that her husband might have been a traitor or deserter despite his distinguished combat record and his obvious dedication to his military duties. The personal investigation extended to Sullivan's family in Iowa, with agents interviewing his parents, siblings, and childhood friends about his character, political views, and any indication that he might have been susceptible to enemy influence or recruitment. These investigations were conducted under the pretext of routine security inquiries, but the intensity and scope of the questioning suggested that serious doubts existed about Sullivan's loyalty and motivations. Family members were bewildered by the implications and deeply hurt by suggestions that their son and brother might have been anything other than a dedicated American serviceman. Physical evidence collection was hampered by the remote location where Sullivan's aircraft had presumably crashed and the investigation team's apparent lack of expertise in aircraft accident analysis. Search teams focused on recovering wreckage that might contain classified equipment rather than determining the cause of the crash through systematic examination of debris patterns and impact evidence. This priority led to superficial examination of potential crash sites and inadequate analysis of the few pieces of debris that were discovered during the extensive search operation. The few pieces of metal and fabric found during the search were subjected to extensive laboratory analysis, but the results were never shared with normal accident investigation procedures or incorporated into standard safety recommendations that might prevent similar incidents. Instead, all physical evidence was classified and removed from normal investigative channels, suggesting that the debris might have revealed information about classified equipment or mission parameters that required protection. The unusual treatment of physical evidence prevented normal accident analysis procedures and contributed to the continuing mystery surrounding Sullivan's fate. Witness interviews revealed a pattern of unusual military activity in the area where Sullivan disappeared, but this information was not incorporated into official findings or used to develop theories about what might have happened to the missing aircraft. Local Residents reported seeing heavy trucks and construction equipment in remote forest areas where no legitimate projects were known to exist, while law enforcement officers recalled being instructed to avoid certain areas during the time period of Sullivan's disappearance. These reports suggested that classified activities were occurring in the region, but investigators showed no interest in pursuing these leads. The investigation's conclusions were as mysterious as the incident itself, providing no meaningful explanation for Sullivan's disappearance, while emphasizing the classified nature of his mission and the security requirements that surrounded the case. The final report, classified and sealed immediately upon completion, officially attributed Sullivan's disappearance to unknown causes during execution of classified reconnaissance mission without making any determination regarding mechanical failure, pilot error, weather conditions, or other factors that might have contributed to the incident. This conclusion satisfied no one and answered none of the questions raised by the mysterious circumstances. The report's recommendations were entirely focused on improving security procedures rather than preventing similar accidents or addressing the aviation safety issues that might have been revealed by proper accident investigation. The emphasis on security over safety suggested that the investigation's real purpose was protecting classified information rather than learning from Sullivan's disappearance to improve military aviation safety. This priority prevented the case from contributing to the body of knowledge that normally results from aircraft accident investigations. Family members and squadron personnel were provided with minimal information about the investigation's findings, creating lasting resentment and suspicion about the military's handling of the case. Sullivan was declared officially dead 6 months after his disappearance, but his family was never informed about the classified nature of his final mission or the unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation. This secrecy prevented normal grieving processes and left lingering questions that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives while creating lasting distrust of official explanations for military incidents. The investigation team's final actions demonstrated that protecting classified information was considered more important than providing closure to grieving families or contributing to aviation safety knowledge. All documentation was sealed in high-security archives with classification levels that would prevent access for decades, while investigation team members were reassigned to different bases and sworn to permanent secrecy about their involvement in the case. Personnel who had participated in the search were transferred or discharged from military service, eliminating potential sources of future information about the case and ensuring that institutional memory of the incident would be lost over time. The decades following Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance were marked by official silence, bureaucratic stonewalling, and the gradual fading off memories as those who knew him grew old and died. The Navy maintained strict classification of all documents related to his final mission, deflecting inquiries from family members, journalists, and researchers with standard responses about national security requirements and ongoing classified operations. This wall of secrecy only deepened the mystery and fueled speculation about what had really happened during those missing minutes over the mountains of Northern California. Catherine Sullivan's efforts to learn the truth about her husband's fate consumed much of her remaining life, becoming an obsession that affected her subsequent relationships and her ability to achieve closure about the tragedy that, despite remarrying in 1951 to a kind man who understood her need to continue searching for answers and raising 3 children who grew up knowing about their stepfather's mysterious predecessor, she never stopped seeking information about James's disappearance. Her correspondence with Navy officials, carefully preserved in family papers, reveals a pattern of polite responses that provided no meaningful information while maintaining the fiction that national security considerations prevented disclosure of relevant details. In 1954, Catherine hired a private investigator named Robert Chin, a former FBI agent who specialized in military cases and had developed contacts throughout the defense establishment during his government service. Chin's investigation uncovered several intriguing leads that seemed to point toward unusual military activities in the Mendocino area during October 1944. A logging crew that had been working in the mountains reported seeing heavy trucks and earth-moving equipment in remote forest areas where no legitimate construction projects were known to exist. While workers described military personnel restricting access to certain areas without explanation, Chen's most significant discovery was a partially burned document found in a trash barrel behind an abandoned military facility near Ukiah, California, which had been used for storage and training purposes during the war years. The document fragment appeared to be part of an operations order referring to Project Redwood and containing geographical coordinates that closely matched Sullivan's assigned reconnaissance route. The document also contained references to experimental aircraft evaluation and German technology assessment, suggesting that Sullivan's mission had involved something far more complex than routine reconnaissance work. However, when Chen attempted to pursue this lead through official channels and contacted former military personnel who might have knowledge about Project Redwood, he was visited by federal agents who confiscated his files and issued clear warnings against continuing his investigation. The agents identified themselves as being from unspecified government agencies and made it clear that further inquiry into the matter would result in serious legal consequences for both Chen and his client. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Some aspects of the Second World War remained too sensitive for civilian investigation even a decade after the conflict's end. The WWII-1960s brought new developments as a generation of investigative journalists began challenging government secrecy and questioning official narratives about wartime operations that had been accepted without scrutiny during the patriotic fervor of the war years. Several prominent reporters attempted to investigate Sullivan's disappearance as part of broader examinations of classified military programs that might have involved questionable activities or represented misuse of government resources. However, their efforts were consistently thwarted by the same wall of official silence that had frustrated earlier inquiries with government officials citing ongoing national security concerns that prevented disclosure of information from the 1940s. Freedom of Information Act requests filed by journalists and researchers were routinely denied on national security grounds, with officials arguing that disclosure of information about Sullivan's mission would reveal intelligence capabilities and operational methods that remained relevant to contemporary military operations. This reasoning seemed increasingly strained as time passed and the technology of the 1940s became obsolete. But government agencies maintained their position that certain wartime secrets would remain classified indefinitely. The persistence of this secrecy began to generate suspicion that the case involved more than routine military operations. Aviation enthusiasts and amateur historians kept interest in the case alive through articles in specialty magazines and presentations at airshow gatherings where veterans shared stories about unusual wartime experiences. These informal investigations produced numerous theories about Sullivan's fate, ranging from mechanical failure in remote terrain to involvement in secret weapons testing programs that might have been based on captured German technology. Some researchers speculated that Sullivan had been conducting surveillance related to suspected German submarine activity along the Pacific coast, while others suggested that he might have been involved in testing experimental aircraft that were too classified for normal military channels. However, none of these theories could be verified without access to classified records that remained firmly sealed in government archives. The few researchers who possessed appropriate security clearances and attempted to access relevant documents were denied permission, suggesting that the case involved agencies or programs that extended beyond normal military operations and into areas that remained sensitive decades after the original events. The continuing classification suggested that Sullivan's mission had touched on matters that government officials considered permanently sensitive. The Cold War era brought additional complications to any investigation of wartime mysteries as government agencies became even more secretive about historical operations that might reveal intelligence capabilities or operational methods still in use against the Soviet Union. The Sullivan case was effectively buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic protection that made meaningful research virtually impossible even for historians and researchers with appropriate security clearances. The case became symbolic of the broader trend toward government secrecy that characterized American intelligence operations during the confrontation with communism. Family. Interest in the case continued through subsequent generations, with Sullivan's nephews and nieces growing up with family stories about their mysterious uncle and occasionally attempting their own investigations as they reached adulthood. In 1978, his nephew Michael Sullivan, who had become a lawyer specializing in government accountability issues, filed a Comprehensive Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, demanding release of all documents related to his uncle's disappearance. The legal battle represented the most serious challenge to the government's secrecy about the case, but it ultimately proved unsuccessful after 6 years of litigation. The lawsuit dragged through federal courts for years before being dismissed on national security grounds, with judges accepting government arguments that disclosure would harm ongoing intelligence operations despite the passage of more than 3 decades since the original incident. The court's reasoning reflected the broader judicial difference to executive branch claims about national security that characterized the Cold War period. But it also suggested that the Sullivan case involved genuinely sensitive matters that extended beyond routine military operations. The legal defeat effectively ended family efforts to obtain official disclosure of relevant information. The 1980s and 90s saw renewed interest in World War II mysteries as classified documents from other wartime programs began to be declassified and released to the public under new policies designed to promote historical transparency. Researchers hoped that Sullivan's case might be included in these releases, particularly as the government began acknowledging previously secret programs involving captured German technology and experimental aircraft development. However, the documents related to Project Redwood and Sullivan's disappearance remained stubbornly classified, with officials maintaining that disclosure would continue to harm national security interests. The few references to Project Redwood that appeared in other declassified materials were so heavily redacted as to provide no useful information about the program's purpose, scope, or connection to Sullivan's disappearance. These fragmentary references confirmed that Project Redwood had existed and had involved classified military activities, but they revealed nothing about what Sullivan had been doing or why his mission had ended in mysterious circumstances. The continued redaction of references to the project suggested that it remained sensitive to contemporary government operations. Advances in computer technology and internet communication during the 1990s allowed researchers to share information more effectively and coordinate their investigations across geographical boundaries. Online forums dedicated to aviation mysteries attracted participants from around the world, some with access to international archives or family documents that shed new light on wartime operations that had been conducted in cooperation with foreign governments. However, the Sullivan case remained frustratingly opaque, with no significant new information emerging despite the efforts of dedicated researchers who pooled their resources and expertise. The international research efforts revealed that several Allied nations had conducted similar programs involving captured German technology during the immediate post-war period, suggesting that Project Redwood might have been part of a broader international effort to acquire and exploit German scientific advances before they could be captured by the Soviet Union. However, foreign archives contain no references to American programs or personnel, indicating that Project Redwood had been conducted with extraordinary secrecy that prevented even Allied governments from learning about its activities. The turn of the 21st century brought hope that changing political attitudes and a passage of time might finally allow disclosure of Second World War secrets that no longer posed genuine security risks to the United States. Several high-profile cases resulted in the declassification of previously protected documents, including information about intelligence operations, experimental weapons programs, and cooperation with former enemy scientists that had been considered too sensitive for disclosure during the Cold War period. These developments encouraged Sullivan's remaining family members to renew their efforts to learn the truth about their relatives' fate. However, their renewed requests for information continued to be denied, with officials citing ongoing intelligence concerns and the need to protect sources and methods that somehow remained sensitive after more than 60 years. The reasoning seemed increasingly implausible as the participants in wartime programs died of old age and the technology of the 1940s became museum pieces. But government agencies maintained their position that certain aspects of Project Redwood required permanent protection. The persistence of this secrecy began to generate conspiracy theories about what Sullivan's mission might have involved. Technology advances during the early 2000s enabled more sophisticated analysis of the limited evidence available about Sullivan's disappearance. Digital enhancement of radar records and witness statements revealed previously unnoticed details, while satellite imagery allowed researchers to examine potential crash sites with unprecedented precision. Ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment became available to civilian researchers, enabling systematic searches of areas where Sullivan's aircraft might have crashed without being immediately visible from ground or air. Despite these technological advantages and the dedication of researchers who spent thousands of hours searching remote areas of Northern California, no trace of the missing Hellcat was discovered. The negative results suggested either that the aircraft had been completely destroyed in a crash, had come down in an area that had not been searched, or had somehow been removed from the crash site by unknown parties. Each possibility raised additional questions about the circumstances of Sullivan's disappearance and the continuing government secrecy surrounding the case. Professional historians studying the Second World War period occasionally encountered tantalizing references to Sullivan's case in other classified documents, but always in heavily redacted contexts that revealed nothing useful about the circumstances of his disappearance. These fragmentary references confirmed that the case remained active in government archives and that decisions about classification were being regularly reviewed and maintained by contemporary officials. The continuing attention to a 60-year-old case suggested that it involved matters that remained relevant to current government operations. The references also indicated that Sullivan's disappearance was connected to other classified programs that had involved experimental aircraft development, German technology acquisition, and secret cooperation between military services and civilian intelligence agencies. The pattern suggested a complex web of classified activities during the final years of World War II that had remained hidden from public view and continued torque-wire protection from disclosure. The scope of these programs appeared far larger than anything that had been publicly acknowledged about American wartime research and development efforts. By the early 2000s, most of the original participants in Sullivan's story had died, taking their knowledge with them to their graves and eliminating potential sources of information about the circumstances of his disappearance. Catherine Sullivan passed away in 1998 without ever learning what had happened to her first husband, dying with unanswered questions that had haunted her for more than 5 decades. Captain Hartley died in 1985, reportedly taking significant secrets about wartime operations to his grave and refusing to discuss classified matters even with his own family members. The few surviving veterans who might have possessed relevant knowledge about Project Redwood or Sullivan's final mission were either unwilling or unable to discuss the case, citing oaths of secrecy that they considered binding for life or suffering from failing memory that made their recollections unreliable. Some veterans hinted that they possessed information about unusual wartime activities, but felt constrained by security obligations that prevented them from sharing their knowledge even decades. After the events, their reluctance to speak suggested that Project Redwood had involved genuinely sensitive matters that participants continued to consider classified. The enduring mystery of Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance had become a symbol of government secrecy and the tension between national security requirements and the public's right to know about historical events. Academic conferences and freedom of information advocacy groups regularly cited the case as an example of excessive classification that served no legitimate contemporary security interest while preventing historical understanding and family closure. However, these protests had no practical effect on the government's determination to maintain secrecy about whatever Sullivan had been doing during his final flight over Northern California. As the 70th anniversary of Sullivan's disappearance approached in 2014, family members made one final attempt to obtain disclosure of relevant documents through a comprehensive petition that emphasized the humanitarian aspects of the case and the lack of any reasonable security justification for continuing classification after 7 decades. Their petition, supported by numerous veterans organizations and historical societies, argued that no legitimate security interest could justify continued protection of information about events that had occurred before most Americans were born. The government's response was unchanged despite the passage of time and the compelling humanitarian arguments presented by Sullivan's family. Officials maintained that national security considerations required continued protection of the information regardless of the personal cost to family members seeking closure or the historical value of the information to researchers studying wartime programs. The response suggested that Project Redwood had involved matters that government officials considered permanently sensitive, extending beyond the normal classification periods that applied to most military operations.